Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of the International Cannabis Conversation, your global tour around international cannabis markets. My name is Chris Day, co-founder of the GCNC and Chief Marketing Officer for Gateway Proven Strategies, your host. And today I'm really excited to have with us John Kagia, the Chief Knowledge Officer of New Frontier Data. We're kicking off the new year in 2022 talking about the global landscape. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Chris, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. This will be not the first show that airs of the new year, but it is the first show that we will have recorded since we flipped the calendar from December 2021 to January 2022. And I got to tell you, I'm not so upset about leaving 2021 behind. I felt like it was hopefully a stair step from 2020, but man, I wouldn't mind a little bit more of normalcy, whatever we call that. I'm not sure what that is anymore. But how about you, John? Any big plans for January of this year?
Looking ahead at a year that we are very hopeful about. As you said, the past 2 years have really kind of taken their toll on all of us, I think, as a global community. So we're hoping that we'll be able to finally break the back of this pandemic and regain some sense of normalcy, be able to reconnect with our communities and start really building again at scale. So.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, right? I know New Frontier has continued to expand a lot. I know the cannabis industry overall has continued to expand a lot. And so while in many ways I think we've felt hampered, at the same time, life and business has gone on. So maybe it would be great, I think, to give the audience a bit of an update on New Frontier before we dive into your reports and what you guys are up to, because I have been impressed with all of the additional growth and reports and content that you guys have been putting out.
Well, thanks very much for saying that, Chris. And it has been an extraordinary kind of evolution over the past 7 years. When we began in late 14, early 15, we were really trying to present objective, rigorously analyzed, deeply insightful perspectives on the legal cannabis industry. But at the time, the legal cannabis industry was largely a function of the North American markets, largely in the US, and even then it was just a handful of states that we were looking at. But as the industry has grown and expanded, so has our mandate. So we've gone from being a largely US-focused organization in the early days to now covering the global cannabinoid economy, both the THC, CBD, and industrial hemp sectors. We've built a phenomenally kind of talented team to help us understand not just the consumers or the policy or the regulations or the business, but we're trying to understand it all. So it's a phenomenally expansive mandate in an industry that is changing faster than any other sector I've studied in my career. But it's been profoundly exciting, and we're really, really keen to see what happens in 2022, because we think this is going to be another both milestone and inflection year for the industry.
Yeah, I know when I founded the Global Cannabis Network Collective now over 2 years ago, and looking around at different places I could send our members to get data and information about global markets, it's shocking to me how few places there are that you can go to actually find it. And I spend time, as you do, every day looking at these different market movements and how things are emerging. And sometimes it can feel just exceedingly overwhelming in terms of how to navigate and how to establish business practices. So I know you guys haven't put out a global market report every year because it's just so vast, but you have come out with one recently. How did you attack that? I think is sort of the first question when trying to pull together all of this different data and information and analysis. How do you go at trying to give a comprehensive view of what's happening around the world in cannabis?
Thank you so much for asking that question because, you know, we've been putting out a lot of numbers over the years, but I think the market doesn't have a full appreciation for how much work goes into putting together something like the global market report. And there's a reason why we don't do it every year. Because one, the markets don't necessarily move that quickly on the global basis. At least in the US and Canada, it's been very dynamic. The global markets have been a little slower to move. But second, you know, it's one thing when you're dealing with, say, 50 states and a few Canadian provinces, an entirely different proposition when you're talking about nearly 200 countries, which all have their own dynamics that you've got to factor into the model. So we literally go country by country, looking at local domestic cannabis demand, usage rates. We look at average prices for cannabis in the countries where that type of data is available. We look at local policy, and we do this in a very systematic way. So basically, we end up with a profile for each individual country, with a model built for each individual country, and then we roll that up into our regional, and then into our national, and then into our global model. So it's a phenomenal amount of work. And one of the things that we actually did this year that was different from our previous iteration of our global estimate is we finally broke out medical, recreational, or adult use, and illicit as three disparate tranches of demand that all roll up into the global total addressable market. So it's we've not seen anyone kind of approach the modeling the way we have, and we think it is a seminal and benchmark way of thinking about the scale of global demand in the world today.
I think it is also. I've been asked for this type of information numerous times over the years, and just figuring out how to attack it, it's really to me, one of the few reasonable ways. And it helps with everything from, hey, I'm starting my business and how do I tackle my home country, as well as I think from an investor standpoint, which is a large part of what's going to drive the future, right? How do you assess what total addressable market is when you're looking at how you deploy capital? So it's great to see. I know from the GCNC perspective, you know, we spent a lot of last year looking at Latin American markets. I get this gut feeling just based on how December closed out and conversations I've had already this year that I'm going to be spending more time looking in Europe this year as well. I'm wondering, when you look at sort of the market movements and where you see these next steps, which areas do you think are going to be drawing the most attention, both from a capital perspective as well as just business startup opportunities in the next 12 to 18 months?
So I think there's a couple of things that are going to be happening in parallel as we look out into 2022 and say mid-late 2020 through to mid-late 2023. First is, we think there's going to be a lot more conversation happening at the national level in countries that have not been on the map for this conversation before. And to your point, you know, the tail end of 2021 was really important with the developments in Europe, with Malta, Luxembourg, and Germany all coming out stating that they're going to advance adult use markets. Now, there's going to be some variability in how each of those countries does it. But, you know, I'm in Kenya right now, and just the impact that those developments had in people saying, wait, what are we missing here? How has this gone from seemingly being a geographically sparse medical market outside of North America to suddenly countries like Germany, which have true global influence, now transitioning to recreational use? I think that accelerates the conversation in countries where there may have been some hesitance to initiate this conversation or start exploring whether this transition to medical is the right one. Second, while Luxembourg and Malta were really important kind of signals of where the momentum is starting to build in Europe toward recreational, I think the development in Germany was particularly noteworthy, partly because this was an announcement being made by a relatively new government. I don't think most people had expected this to be one of the first big statements being made by the coalition government coming out of September's election. And then two, as Europe's largest and most influential economy, one has to expect that this is going to create a gravity that's going to pull in a lot of Germany's neighbors who may have been taking a very laissez-faire approach toward cannabis. But it's going to lead both, I think, a lot of consumers as well as a lot of lawmakers to start saying, is this something that we want to follow Germany into? Germany is going to attract a huge amount of interest, and I think it's also going to start catalyzing interest from US players in particular, who have largely given the European markets scant attention. There's been so much opportunity in the North American market, in the US market specifically, that short of Curaleaf, there's just not been a lot of action with American companies looking to kind of plant big flags in Europe. And I think this development in Germany will make a lot more companies start to say, is this a place where we want to at least plant a flag or get a foot in the door, even if we continue to prioritize the very significant opportunity in North America.
Yeah, I also wonder, touching on the North American discussion a little bit and that connectivity we have naturally with Europe. While we all know the U.S. government hang-ups, I guess we'll just call them for now, it does make me wonder if companies outside the U.S. that aren't Canadian-based are going to start looking more for ways to, get their foot in the door into the U.S. in anticipation of future changes at some point. I've certainly had more conversations lately with Australia or European-based companies saying, hey, maybe it's time for us to pay attention to the U.S., even though they're taking their sweet time. I do think that kind of cross-the-ocean conversation is going to be more frequent. What do you think?
Completely agree. And so despite the fact that there had been a lot of expectation at the beginning of 2021 that 2021 might be the year that we finally see Congress tackle cannabis descheduling or cannabis reform, that it has not been the case. And looking at the political landscape for 2022, I think legislative reform would face a pretty difficult path to approval. However, it's clear that there's momentum building toward change. And when you look at the scale of the global total addressable market, so for 2022, we're looking at a market that would be just below $450 billion. Of that, the legal market will be about $36 billion, $36.5 billion. And the overwhelming proportion of that is going to be in the United States. So when we're talking about a global legal market, one must understand that right now the bulk of the capital is the bulk of the revenue is being generated by American companies. That's going to be the case for the foreseeable future, just because of the scale and the number of legal markets that are open in the U.S. And so it makes a lot of sense for companies to start thinking creatively now on how to get a foot in the door. If we assume that federal reform is going to be happening in the next couple of years. Pressure is mounting on Washington. We know this is an issue that will get resolved at some point. This bill running a legal state market while it remains illicit is just not illicit at the federal level is just not indefinitely sustainable. So we know change is going to happen at some point, and we think the companies that are proactive in securing a strategic position or a strategic avenue by which to enter the market early should be well positioned to capitalize on what we think is going to be an explosive opportunity once that switch gets flipped.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, shifting back to the European discussion for a bit, and the fact that when you talk to South American producers or African producers, a lot of that is focused on how do I get my product from where I am into Europe, right? So whether realistic or not, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. That's a common discussion. And I am wondering, we sort of glossed over Africa earlier in the conversation, but I think we should circle back because the traditional markets of flow of agricultural products, produce and such from Africa into Europe is prominent. We've talked about it on this show before. And I have seen at least signs of life that some of those markets are coming along. When you were doing your research and your study, did you see any sort of supporting data that would say my gut instinct is at least on the right track for people trying to push forward there?
Yes, for sure. And actually, you might not be aware of this, but I came to Kenya at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, and I've been based on the continent since then. So I feel like I've had a front row view to the evolution of this conversation on the continent. And it has been really striking how quickly things have moved. We now have nearly half a dozen, or nearly a dozen countries that have legalized medical use. And I expect over the next 2 years, we'll probably add another 6 or 7 countries to that list. Yes, most countries are still in the policy formulation, early stages of operationalization of their markets, but many of them are approaching this industry with the expectation that they will be able to serve the European market. Now, that presents its own set of risks. I think, when you combine the total amount of capacity that will be produced by Africa and Latin America combined, one has to wonder how much of that output the European markets will be able to absorb.
Yep.
And so one of the cautions that we've been bringing is this idea that if you're establishing a regulated cannabis market in a developing economy, think first about the domestic market opportunity, even as you look toward how you might be able to serve international markets. Because it's going to take a while before Europe is able to absorb the scale of production that is going to be coming online in these developing economies over the next couple of years, over the next 5 years. And it would be really unfortunate if, due to a lack of planning, you end up having this massive glut hit the market that craters the cannabis economies in these countries that are just getting off the ground. And then it takes them 5-10 years to recover after the fact because they weren't able to move that first massive cycles of harvest.
Yeah, I've had similar conversations in South America, right, with countries there. It's all about think local,
Yep.
act global, but make sure that you build this stair step in your company so that you can survive off of a smaller, thoughtful approach, and then make sure that you have the ability to scale. I think it's great. Early on when we were talking about the formulation of your report, you had talked about creating the tranches, and I thought that made great sense. You also referenced something that I think we all know in the back of our heads, but we don't reiterate enough, and that is that this industry is built off of much more than a single cannabinoid, right? It's not just all about THC. It's not all about CBD. We've got industrial hemp. We have this complexity of market types. I did want to touch on sort of hemp and how that's playing. I see that as being a large sort of player in the normalization of the discussion and how that's coming. We know that is something that comes out of Asia a lot. I mean, China's the largest manufacturer of hemp in the world, as far as I know. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But how do you see the diversity of this discussion helping to drive the markets forward, or not?
So we think hemp is going to be an integral part of this opportunity, and candidly, we think that as we look out into the medium and long term, the industrial hemp sector could dwarf the THC market opportunity by a magnitude of order, just because of the number of different ways in which industrial hemp can be used. The challenge that industrial hemp is facing right now is infrastructure that can process hemp biomass in all its myriad forms at scale. Whether that's processing the hemp fiber at scale, which I think remains a major bottleneck in this industry. There are just not that many decorticators around the world that can do this at a scale that can rival cotton, the way that cotton, hemp, jute, and other common textile fibers are processed. And so kind of the investments into the R&D around production, industrial scale production and manufacturing of hemp products, I think is going to be the critical milestone that we'll need to achieve over the next couple of years to open up this opportunity fully. The Chinese have invested already very significantly in cultivation. They've started investing heavily in manufacturing capacity. But given the spectrum of applications for which hemp can be used, the fiber, the bioplastics, the biofuels, the textiles, animal feed, animal bedding, and down the line, these are going to be emerging initially as micro pockets within the broader cannabinoid ecosystem. But we're watching all of them quite closely because we think all it's going to take is 2 or 3 applications to really gain traction, to dramatically open up the way that stakeholders globally think about how they might be able to integrate hemp into their agricultural economies. And then second, the fact that it is non-psychoactive, whether it's on the oil side or on things like hemp seed and grain, it does help allay a lot of the concerns that some more conservative stakeholders might have around high THC, while still allowing the economies to activate the cannabis, quote unquote, opportunity. So it helps open the door. People will see that the sky's not going to fall. And we think that ends up being a critical way to help advance this industry, particularly in the regions of the world where there might still be some reservation about, say, going straight to medical, let alone going to adult use.
Yeah, I think from a public relations and communications perspective, for sure, it does give us this additional angle to continue to counter propaganda that's been around for so long and to highlight sort of the diversity of the plant and get out of that really awkward conversation which has been countered so many times, and I think it's just a matter of continuing to further that conversation.
I think
Go
point
ahead.
there that you make that I think is also really important around the messaging, which is I think 2022 is going to be another inflection year for the conversation around climate change and economic sustainability. And as we look at hemp as a potential substitute for whether it's fossil fuels or more resource-intensive crops in our agricultural economy, I think there's a lot of consumers who are open to that conversation in a way that has expanded dramatically over the past couple of years. And that presents an additional opportunity to help drive engagement, investment, and innovation in hemp, because we think it can play a supporting role as part of a more broad and comprehensive approach to trying to mitigate the challenges and risks presented by climate change.
Yeah, for sure. I think the whole notion of regenerative crops is such a new concept to the vast majority of the population that you're right. I have been talking to people about it for 3 or 4 years, but only in the last 6 months even will I say that the velocity of the conversation has gotten to the point where at least some of the people in the room know what I'm talking about. So, but it's a good sign. It's a good sign because it does mean that we're making progress. The discussion around climate change has gained so much velocity. People are going to be seeking out these types of conversations. And this will be a great place for those of us who have been tracking it to talk further and hopefully drive not only the business opportunity discussion, but also the social responsibility discussion and the societal impact discussion, which I think overall is as much of what the cannabis industry should be about as anything else, is helping to further those kinds of topics and discussions. John, as we've been going through here, I've been thinking there's so much. I haven't even really gotten to the point where I feel like we've touched on the introduction of the global market report that you guys did. So I encourage listeners to go to your website, New Frontier Data, and download it. I know people can get it for download there. I think it's free. It's about 123 pages or so long, so there's a ton of information there. And it feels like we should schedule touch bases on these topics, like maybe once a quarter with you to get into it further. I sort of just dropped that on you because I know I didn't ask in advance, but ponder that because I'd love to do that. It would be great.
As our conversations, I'd be delighted to do that.
That would be great. Yeah, and so before we sort of sign out for this particular episode, you know, if you wanted to get one thing across to people about global movements and where we're headed in the next year, what would that be? What would sort of the closing thought that you'd want people to take be?
Focus on where the market is going, not where it currently is. So we fully expect that there's going to be some turbulence in this market, and likely in the broader economy as we go into 2022. There's already some economic headwinds that are manifesting. An economic downturn could impact things like investment flow into the industry and that sort of thing. But if you think about the way public attitudes globally are shifting around this issue, it is inevitable that we're going to see far more markets that are open to legalizing and regulating cannabis by the time we get to the end of this year, going to 2023, than we had at the beginning of this year. We think that the conversation around a global cannabis economy is going to be far more sophisticated this year than it was last year or the year before that. And so even as there's going to be some churn and turbulence in this market based on some of these broader market global forces, don't lose sight of the fact that there's an intense amount of momentum in the shift of public attitudes and this idea of the normalization of cannabis in our society. And the more that quickens, the more expansively legalization is going to extend into these markets, and the greater the opportunity that's going to be stimulated by this shift. So while there's going to be churn in the near term, don't lose sight of the much broader, significant, long-term opportunity that this market will continue to present.
Sounds perfect. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you joining us on this episode of the International Cannabis Conversation. To everybody out there in podcast land, thanks so much for listening every couple of weeks. We love talking to you about this journey around the cannabis world. If you haven't subscribed yet, it's definitely time. We've been doing this now almost 2 years, so hit that subscribe button.